Hi everyone, I'm Ian. Every few years, developers release a new console. Sometimes they're a hit, and sometimes they're not. But why? Well, it can be for a variety of reasons. Weird controls, but there's the Wii. Shovelware? Wii fits that one too. Poor specs? And there's still the Wii. How do you even quantify a failed console? You could go by total sales, say under 50 million, but then you eliminate the SNES and N64. There's also based on release date. I mean, consoles in the 80s and 90s weren't as popular, but then you alienate the Game Boy, PS1, and NES. So how do you decide a failed console?
Console failures are very hard to figure out. There's plenty of different ways that you could say a console failed, but what's the right way? It really depends on the console that you're looking at. No two console failures are the same, but let's look at some that I find interesting or funny. The PSP Go. The PSP was Sony's launch into the handheld market. It was quite successful, selling between 80 and 82 million consoles. The PSP Go was a cheaper alternative to the PSP. What made it so Go was the fact that it didn't support physical games. Not too big of a deal today, but in 2009 on a handheld console with only 16 gigabytes of storage, it didn't really work. It's unknown how many units actually sold, but apparently, on day one in Japan, the PSP Go only sold 14 units. Today, digital-only consoles are quite common, with both Microsoft and Sony doing it with the Xbox Series S and PS5 digital. Now, I don't really like digital consoles because I like being able to hold the games that I own, and you can't really do that with electricity.
Well, you can, but it's tingly.
Moving along, it's the Virtual Boy, which suffers from the problem of
Everything is red. Is this what pink eyes like?
being released in the mid-90s. Nintendo really got ahead of themselves and everyone else. Selling only 770,000, the Virtual Boy failed for a few reasons. It was way too expensive at $179.95, or about $300 today. It also caused severe headaches due to the way that the screen works. The screen is technically 384 by 224 pixels, but it's really a single row of 224 LEDs that use an oscillating mirror to turn it into a full display. Because of this, if you have photosensitive epilepsy, you would have some problems. The screen is also 2-bit colors, meaning that it has 3 shades of red and 1 shade of black. The manual actually says that you should only play for about an hour before taking a 10 to 15 minute break. The Virtual Boy also didn't have a head strap, so if you wanted to play it, you either had to lean over a table, lay down with it on top of you, or tape it to your head. Up next is the Atari 5200. Now, almost everyone knows about the Atari 2600, but not everyone knows about its successor. The Atari 5200 did nowhere as well as the 2600, and for some good reasons. It never really got any of its own games, only remade versions of the 2600 games, but it also couldn't play 2600 games, something that the Intellivision could do at the time with the help of an adapter. Although this was later fixed with a future version which had 2 ports and an adapter for the original model 5200, it never really caught back up. The 5200 also had problems with its packing controllers, many of which broke over time and suffered the current day problem of stick drift. Along with all this, the 5200 was released just a year before the video game crash of 1983, caused in part by the console developer, Atari. Poor timing, poor design, and poor quality were all reasons the Atari 5200 sucked. This list wouldn't be complete without another Atari console. This time it's the Atari Lynx. The Lynx came out around the same time as the original Game Boy, one of the best-selling consoles ever, and Atari really tried to compete with Nintendo by including a color display. It really didn't fall into the same market as the Game Boy though. At that time the Game Boy only costed $90. But the Lynx came in at 2 times that at $180. Along with the high price, the Lynx didn't really get a whole lot of games, and its color screen was all really muted colors and was very difficult to see. Coming in next is something really weird. The Philips, no. Sanyo, wait, Gold Star? Nope. Creative Technology? Whoever made it, 3DO. The whole marketing campaign of the 3DO was a big part of its downfall. It was advertised that Nintendo and Sega were baby toys. Yeah, like I would ever let a baby anywhere near this. The 3DO was also priced much higher than any other console on the market at $700. It also didn't have many good games, with the best-selling one being Gex. There were also too many companies making 8 total different models. Some had different features like expansion cards or a 5-disc CD drive, but some were just models for certain markets. Now for a console that got a developer into court and part of the reason the ESRB exists. Not exactly though. The Sega CD wasn't really its own console. It was actually an add-on for the Sega Genesis, but it didn't sell for a number of reasons. One of the first being that it piggybacks off of Genesis hardware, so Sega tried to revive the Genesis with this cool new add-on. Another being the court case against video games due to there not being a rating system in place. Games like Mortal Kombat and Night Trap were two of many examples. Night Trap was the big one. Any kid could buy it off the shelf and see many bad things that I really can't show. Sega and the Sega CD ended up getting a bad rap for this, stunting the sales of the Sega CD. Finally, another handheld, and it's the N-Gage, oh man. The Nokia N-Gage was a very unique console for the time. It wasn't only a console, but also a cell phone, neither of which it did well. There were only 58 games released for it, which, although that's more than the Virtual Boy, none of them were really good. Most of the problem being that the screen is 4x3 vertical, so there's not much field of view. It did get some big game series on it though, including Call of Duty, Civilization 2, Rayman, Sonic, The Sims, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, and The Elder Scrolls. Despite this, it didn't really sell well, but sold enough to get a revision. Both models had the problem of a very odd shape, and you'd have to use it on its side, but the second model, known as the N-Gage QD, was smaller and lighter than the original model. A more notable console, the Sega Dreamcast, also known as the end of Sega as a console developer. The Dreamcast was actually quite popular, and it's where 3D Sonic games started. Maybe that's not such a good thing. One of the biggest problems with the Dreamcast is that it didn't get much support from EA and Squaresoft, two of the biggest developers for Sega consoles. Though it did run off a custom version of Windows, which made it easy to port games to it, which is the case with Phantasy Star Online, which actually makes Sega one of the first companies to make an online console. After the failure of the Sega Saturn, due to it being difficult to make games for, the Dreamcast was a great option for developers. Even though it was better than the Saturn, it sadly still didn't sell very well, pushing Sega to end development of consoles after 18 years. Up next is the PS Vita, another Sony handheld. They really aren't good at this. The PS Vita was the successor to the PSP and competitor to the 3DS. Sony competed at Nintendo's own game. The PS Vita had a touchscreen and touch back, but it ended up not getting much support from Sony themselves. It also came out too close to the release of the PS4, with Sony pushing more towards that. The Wii U! Another instance of poor support, but it's not only from third parties, but from Nintendo themselves. Nintendo didn't really develop anything that needed the Wii U's gamepad. Actually, they didn't really develop anything for the Wii U. After poor initial sales due to poor marketing, the Wii U never did well, but I still think that it's a good stepping stone between the Wii and the Switch, both of which are highly successful consoles. When Nintendo first unveiled the Wii U, many consumers thought that it was just an add-on for the Wii. The system was also competing with much more powerful consoles, so many games on those consoles never came to the Wii U. Finally, we have the GameCube.
But the GameCube isn't a failure. People love it.
That may be true, but it still didn't sell very well. Less than its predecessor, the N64, and its successor, the Wii. Part of the problem is that Nintendo had always stuck with more family-friendly games like Super Mario, Animal Crossing, and The Legend of Zelda. The GameCube also had to compete with Xbox and PS2, which were much more powerful consoles. Another problem was there wasn't a mainline Mario game upon launch, instead launching with Luigi's Mansion. Along with that, a gripe from reviewers is that the GameCube felt more like a toy, especially competing with Microsoft and Sony.
Though some of these consoles don't really feel like they were failures, when you look at it, they were. Sure, you can't pin down exactly what's going to make a console a failure, but you can see it when it happens.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider liking. Want to keep up with what I'm doing? Consider subscribing as it helps me out a lot. Have any suggestions for videos? Leave a comment.